not business as usual. Will that be the case as well for the Leaders Summit next week in Bali?
That may be the case. And I suppose I do understand how these differences of perspectives, are exacerbated with the current geopolitical climate. It is, a lot of analysts, some experts perhaps, are drawing this sort of Bali summit as the beginning of an even more contentious world politics in the next couple of years or even decades to come, with a renewed sort of emphasis to Cold War-esque diplomacy, of the Western world versus the Eastern world, the first world and the second world or something. I have so far resisted to use the term Cold War-esque diplomacy. I still believe that there is an element where all the world governments of all hundreds of sovereign states across the world can come to an agreement on issues that are very pertinent, that are pertinent to us. Even just this week with COP27 happening in Egypt, yes. Despite the rhetoric being very very low, very pessimistic on the outcome of COP27, but at least it's still there, that there is still an appetite for all the world governments to tackle these issues together, not having a separate climate summit just for the Western world, or maybe for the world, the Russian friendly groups, Russian friendly countries, or Chinese friendly countries, or ASEAN friendly countries, or something like that. So despite all these sort of fear, I do still find that there are appetites in discourse, but it is not to say, yes, that there are risks that we are looking at, geopolitical risks that we are looking at, has seem to go into the way that countries are going, to cordon themselves off, to find their own coalition and to find their own like-minded states. And this is where, for some years, we have somewhat overlooked the power of Indonesia as a non-aligned state, as a state that does not align itself to one power or governments and their leaders at an equal footing. And I think this is something that we need to echo even larger now, to ensure and to make these Western countries or any other countries with their very strong ideological understanding that we will not ascribe to a to a coalition, to a divided world. We stand with everyone, friends and foes alike, and we reserve ourselves, especially this area of the world, Southeast Asia, we reserve this part of the world to be to allow for frank and open conversation and diplomacy, to ensure and to find whatever outcomes and solutions can be drawn up from any sort of differences that are currently present.
Yeah, Joe Devi, it's been said over and over again throughout our G20 presidency, no one should be left behind. Exactly. Pandemic recovery, food and energy security, and that's also been echoed by our Foreign Ministers Retno Marsudi in many occasions. So we should all come together, find a common grounds, find win-win solutions amidst all of these security issues, amidst all of these geopolitical tensions. And it's also interesting when Gilang touched on the COP27 taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh at the moment in Egypt, saying that there is a pessimistic because what's making headline this week, Joe Devi and also Gilang, was that this is an event about climate change, how we can go forward towards net zero emissions. However, hundreds upon hundreds of private jets, of celebrities, of heads of states, of delegates are flying into Egypt. Are flying into Egypt. That totally negates the efforts for the net zero emission.
It's
a question now to Gilang.
Okay, Gilang, still related to the G20 summit. In your opinion, what is the most possible approach peace broker related to the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine using the G20 mechanism. What do you think, in your opinion?
Right. Finding solutions in a multilateral fora is the hardest job any diplomat would have to do, or any world leader would have to do. You see how the United Nations are, actively being criticized for their lack of ability to quell conflicts, to put aside differences, and to provide a sort of agreement on various things. Nations are divided there. The G20, with much less number of states involved, but still make up one of the highest, the top ranking economics across the world. One of the lowest common denominator, to find that same shared cause between the 20 member states of what can be conducted, or what solutions can we offer to the problems at hand. If we push too far, if we push for things to be, we push on an ideological level, we only want this. If we don't make compromises, if we don't allow ourselves a degree of flexibility, then of course we're going to go into, as I mentioned, the path where G20 is going to be split up. Then there's going to be a lot of resentments between one another. Mm-hmm. So finding the lowest common denominator, coupled with a degree of flexibility and willingness to engage with all members, is a key consideration for Indonesia. And in a way, I cannot think of, let's say, if the G20 of 2022 was to be, or is to be held, let's say in Washington, in the United States, or in London, in the UK, things will be very different. It will be much more contentious G20. It would provide. It would be like a batting cage, a boxing ring, something. But thankfully, we're looking at a G20 in Indonesia. A country where we allow differences to come, to be present, and we open up the room, and we provide platforms for discussions, engagement, arguments whatsoever. And then we can find, all right, so you have your case, you provided your case, and let's work it out until we find the lowest common denominator.
These two conflicting countries?
In regards with the Russo-Ukrainian war in general, no, I don't think it will come up with any solutions that would result to a lasting peace there. But if it dissects into each of the problems that are caused or directly linked towards the Russo-Ukrainian war, such as food security, energy security, migration, perhaps to an extent, flow of finance, and etc. Yes, I think it would be an issue where G20 can mitigate, can provide a buffer sort of effect, a bumper effect to minimize any sort of effects from these crises, whatever mechanisms, whatever agreements, then they may come up. So it has G20 has to look into the war in a very microscopic way. It needs to look into what sort of effects it has created. If it looks at the war through a microscopic lens, looking at this war should stop, Russia should get out of Ukraine, Ukraine should return to its pre-2014 borders, for example, it will definitely come to an instant failure. Because even even with the United Nations incapable of doing so, it will be a very different story with G20. I mean, it will be even less success if we pursue it in a more strategic and microscopic level. So my suggestion is we look into it in a very microscopic level. We look into issues. We tackle onto these issues in a very direct, in a very surgically way. So we surgically removed the issues that are affected by the Russo-Ukrainian war, not the war in general itself.
Right. Gilang, do you think that next week's Leader Summit here in Nusa Dua, Bali will transpire in the most normative way imaginable to mind?
It is something that we can hope for, I suppose. That a normative sort of situation might develop. That it may seem quite boring but it also look into a quite a relief that things can go on in a civilized way, and this is something that we can expect. But again, anything can happen. Perhaps some mishaps here and there, something that we need to prepare as well. But nonetheless, I suppose the bar is set quite low in achieving a successful G20 summit, in a way that if we can keep all manners of discussion in a civilized way, and then all sort of statement be carried out in a normative sense. And I think that's where we can pull off a successful G20 summit.
Right. Gilang, what sort of narrative do you predict that the Western alliances, because we know that Joe Biden has confirmed to attend, and we certainly hope the newly elected and appointed Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak, will attend as well, and probably Justin Trudeau, Emmanuel Macron. These heads of states of the Western alliances, what do you think they have in mind prior to attending the leaders' summit of the G20 in Bali in regards to the Ukrainian and Russian conflict at the moment?
Right. So of course, I wouldn't think that they would do anything too drastic in the lens of G20. Again, as I mentioned, we're going to have to find the lowest common denominator for every country to find an agreement. Even if they would push their own agenda in the G20, their sole unilateral agenda on stopping the war, on criticizing Russia, or even enacting further economic sanctions through the G20 against Russia, nothing will come out of it. But I think the actions will come on the sideline. The actions may come from the sideline meetings that may happen between Western countries, whether it's US with the UK, or UK with Canada, or anything else, or any countries that are represented within the G20, or maybe even sideline meetings between Western countries with Indonesia, or Western countries with India, for example. India has appeared and has been highlighted in many cases, especially in many Western media, of failing to oblige by sort of like the Western ideology or Western rules against Russia, in a way that India is still pretty much doing business with Russia, business as usual. They're not technically supporting in a way that China does, but they do ensure that that revenues are still coming into the Russian coffers via their trade. So it would be very interesting to see what sort of things that the Western countries may expect out of India's presidency of G20 next year, because presidency will come to an end in the next couple of days, right? So I think the focus now is not only just on what are going to be discussed at the summit, or what can be agreed upon by all the 20 member states, but what sort of agenda can these Western states push to India as the head of G20 next year. You got to start them early, right? You got to start them small. The thing is, we did not expect a war to happen in November 2021, but now we have a deteriorating situation of geopolitics. I think the Western countries are going to reach their position by advocating or maybe lobbying for India at next year's G20.
All right. Okay. Gilang, we touched a little bit on the non-alliances state of Indonesia, but also this is echoed by other countries as well. China, for example, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, they seem to be so chill about this. Why do you think that is? Is this solely due to the economic ties that they have with Russia, or any other factors that can be accounted for?
So as I mentioned, there are, even though, like, for example, China and other countries that are in support of China are part of a non-aligned group. The non-aligned movement existed since the mid-20th century, right? but we are looking at now even fairly divided countries in respect to their views and perspectives of being non-aligned. Take China, for example. You know, various countries across the world, whether it's on the United Nations, or even bilaterally, or any other multilateral fora. Now, China has been very active to build its own coalition, to build its own, friendly ties with countries across the world. If we can remember, like last year, we have an example of China creating an organization, or at least a group of countries called the Group of Friends in the Defense of the United Nations Charter. That sort of group has the focus, is united under the goal of claiming to be the victim of the unilateral actions, mainly by Western countries. And within that group, we have China, we have Russia, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba. Countries that have experiencing sanctions, experiencing economic sanctions, and have been embargoed by Western countries. So they're now sort of like building a new sort of non-aligned groupings, or sort of a different mold of coalition. It doesn't amount, or at least from Chinese perspective, it is not an alliance. It's not in the same sort of manner as Quad or AUKUS or NATO, or even any other alliance in particular. But it's a group of friendly countries. It's countries that are and that they claim enshrining, or at least in promoting the UN Charter. So they in a way, this chillness factor, I suppose, the way that they want to engage, Russia and etc. It's united because of their sort of not necessarily fear, but perhaps their resentment towards the Western world and the system that the West has created in the past couple of decades.
Okay, Gilang, you mentioned before that the G20 summit here in Bali will not come up with a solution regarding the geopolitical tension between Russia and Ukraine. Do you think that the war is getting spread and drag more countries into the war? And if it really occurs, do you think that what would be the consequences if the war is really occurring? Because there is no solution regarding the geopolitical tension right now.
In a way, there is this indication that the war has dragged even more countries into the foray. I mean, just a couple of weeks before, we have heard that Russia has bought a number of Iranian military equipments to be utilized within Ukraine, and we've seen footage of Kiev being bombarded by these so-called kamikaze drones, suicidal drones, serving as like a bomb, destroying civilian facilities, infrastructures, and targeting military targets across Ukraine. And this sort of dragging countries within the conflict, it may not drag them physically in a way that countries like Iran has sent their troops to Ukraine, or the Western countries like NATO, for example, have resorted to also putting their troops in Ukraine. It may have not gone into that direction yet. But yes, there is this indication that even more countries are now going to be dragged into it, if it's not through physical means, if it's not through providing physical, troops on the ground, but it is providing material aspects. And as long as the war is still dragged out, and as long as Russia, or at least this sort of division between the West, Russia, and other Russian-aligned countries still exists, I wouldn't be surprised that even more countries would start to support and perhaps even provide material support towards Russia. I mean, we've also heard how Russia has bought ammunitions from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, from North Korea, just to mitigate their shortages of military equipments, right? And if these things dragged out, there will be a very clear distinction, right, of the right and the left, on the West and the East. It would evolve into a war between blocs, perhaps. I do hope that it will not transpire in that way. It would not go in the way of a war, a world war, perhaps. But we're looking at this dividing lines between countries, whether it's on ideological line, whether it's on political lines, but we are looking at a very divided world at the moment.
Right. So you mentioned the dividing lines that is now, being more palpable over and over again. And the collateral damages that we've touched on earlier, the food and energy securities, exacerbated by the geopolitical tensions, the ongoing war in Ukraine as well. A concept that has been proposed by the government of Indonesia through different working groups and represented by the Foreign Affairs Ministry of Indonesia as well, is that we need to hold on more to multilateralism and for the food supply chains to stop protectionisms. Do you think that with all of these dividing lines that we see more and more, Russia will take less part in this, Gilang?
No, I don't think Russia in a way will play less part, or maybe Russia will play more active parts to their own sort of multilateral organizations. You mentioned that we need to focus more on multilateralism. Our government supports the essence of multilateralism, and rightly so. We do try to ensure that multilateralism is alive and kicking in a way that countries can air out their differences within that multilateral organizations. But we're also looking at countries like Russia who are also in support of multilateralism, but they seem to be more garnered to their own version of multilateralism, to their own sort of organizations where they know that their voice echoes much more powerful than in other organizations such as maybe G20, maybe the United Nations, or even other organizations that Russia is involved. So we're looking at, for example, Shanghai Cooperative Organization, SCO. We're looking at the Eurasia Economic Union. We're looking at the Commonwealth of Independent States, where all of these multilateral organizations feature Russia in it, and featured Russia in a sort of like a driving seat, where they do have political clout, they do have the influence, and they do have the raw materials, or at least prior to the war in Ukraine, they have the materials to keep this multilateral going. Now, what we need to avoid is this sort of multilateralism, but only to our benefit, right? We have to ensure that a multilateralism that the world has is the one that can cater into the benefits of all, that can mitigate the differences of all parties across the world, of all communities across the world, not just to the interests of Southeast Asia per se, or the interests of Eurasia, or the interests of Western Europe or Europe per se, but it needs to take into account the issues that are being faced across the world, or at least within the larger region that we are currently living in. So even with the support of multilateralism, it is also now sort of divided. There are nuances that are now present. Countries may say the same thing, but they may have different sort of intentions using that sort of the same idealism that they support.
All right. Gilang, just the final 5 minutes of our conversations. We do have two more questions, just one from me. Looking back into Nusa Dua, Bali, where next week the Leaders Summit will take place, and Vladimir Putin is confirmed to attend virtually. He'll deliver his remarks. What do you think he will say at the forum, if we can predict at all?
Well, if I could remember his comment during Valdai, not a couple of months before, I would say that it will be a combination of that. The rhetoric that the Western sort of ideology has to be pushed back, and then that it needs to be challenged, and etc. coupled with the necessity of Russia to regain its sort of sovereignty and dignity and etc. Also with a couple of flares on the issue at hand, suggest that yes, Russia pays attention to the current situation in regards with food crisis, energy crisis, and etc. and has allowed itself to mitigate solutions. I mean, Russia technically it does sell its natural gas and oil to countries across the world. It's just that Western countries have boycotted and embargoed them, so they reap the consequences of that. But for us, we are freely allowed to buy Russian oil and Russian gas, right? India has bought Russian gas and oil. China has bought it. So I think it will be a narrative that Russia can push in a way that they do open themselves to the world, but it's the Western world that has limited Russia's ability to engage with the rest of the world. So it would be I think it would be a narrative that would be pushed. So in a way, in a nutshell, Putin might present Russia as the victim here in the G20.
Okay, Gilang, one last question for you. What will G20 come up related to the Russia and Ukraine geopolitical tension?
But last question is always a difficult one. But it is very tricky. But definitely the G20 will try. First of all, it will try to find ways to say that all parties need to restrain, right? Mm-hmm. Need to find ways to restrain themselves and to open pathways and alleyways for dialogues. I think that's a very basic stance of sort of a communique. And then it would then look into the various aspects of humanitarian issues. For example, finding ways to provide aids and humanitarian corridors, and also ensuring that trade commodities, valuable commodities, strategic commodities, be allowed to resume their movement without restrictions, or with as little restrictions as possible, because restrictions have caused all of these crises. I think that's the very bare minimum that the G20 can somewhat agreed upon, without touching the issue of blaming things on Russia, without supporting Ukraine per se, without even mentioning that Zelensky is a hero, that he's pushing back Russia, and et cetera, et cetera. I think it would be the very least common denominator that they could agree upon, and that anything else may be reserved for next year's G20. But I think that's just a very, I suppose, a bland, sort of very basic analysis from me. I do hope for something much more robust, something that would be very concrete, but owing to the sort of set of working groups and also outcomes that Indonesia has poised for the G20 this year, I think there's very little room for anything concrete for the Russia-Ukrainian war.
Right, so we'll just have to look forward to seeing what the common denominator will be, and the common ground will be for all of these heads of states of the G20 member states and all the observing countries as well, and see how things will unfold during the summit. And Gilang, surely hope that we'll see you during the day of the summit, so as to help us dissect what exactly transpires during the deliberation. So Gilang Kembara from CSIS in the capital Jakarta, we always have the pleasure to hear your insights here in the program. Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Well, now we're moving to the next news before handing over the presidency of the 2022 G20 to Indonesia on October 31st, 2021. Italy was the host of 2021 G20 summit themed People, Planet and Prosperity that was held in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic surge.
Well, yeah, we have summed up a brief introduction for you, and today on our country profile, we have Italy. So let's have a look.
Italy is located in southern Europe on the Apennine Peninsula. Its distinct shape, resembling a kicking boot, makes it easy to recognize it on the map. Italy has a population of more than 59.6 million people. The capital and largest city is Rome. Other major cities are Florence, Milan, Naples, and Venice. Spoken language is only Italian. Tourism in Italy is one of the economic sector of the country. Italy is the 5th most visited country in international tourism arrival. With 94 million tourists per year, Italy is the 4th most visited country in the world. People mainly visit Italy for its rich culture, cuisine, history, fashion, and art, its beautiful coastline and beaches, its mountains, and priceless ancient monuments. Italy also contains more World Heritage Sites than any other country in the world. As the birthplace of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, it's not surprising that Italy is so rich in masterpieces of art and architecture. It should have more UNESCO World Heritage cultural sites than any other country in the world. The most visited sites include Colosseum, Florence Duomo Santa Maria del Fiore, the Grand Canal in Venice, Leaning Tower of Pisa, and Vatican City. Italy is a parliamentary republic since June 1946, when the monarchy was abolished. The Italian parliament is a bicameral legislature that consists of the Senate of the Republic and the House of Representatives. Executive power is exercised by the Council of Ministers, which is headed by the Prime Minister. Head of state is the President. Hard-right leader Giorgia Meloni was sworn in as Italy's first female Prime Minister on October 22nd, replacing Mario Draghi, who resigned on July 22nd this year. The 45-year-old leader was named as the Italian Prime Minister after her party, Brothers of Italy, won more than 25% of the vote in snap elections.
Della Repubblica di Indonesia.
Italy is among active members of the G20. At the time when a collective effort was needed to cope with the unprecedented impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, Italy took on presidency of the G20, the main forum for global economic and financial cooperation, on December 1st, 2020.
All the best in the coming year, and I trust that under your leadership,
Perdana Menteri Mario Draghi, Yang Mulia, saya menyampaikan selamat kepada Italia.
Prior to the closing ceremony of G20 summit in Rome in October 2021, the Italian Prime Minister Draghi handed over a hammer to President Joko Widodo as a symbolic handover of the G20 presidency from Italy to Indonesia. For the first time since the G20 was founded in 1999, Indonesia has been appointed to assume the G20 presidency starting from December 1st, 2021 to November 30th, 2022. Italy's economy is the third largest national economy in the European Union. After a sharp 6.6% rebound in 2021, Italy's GDP growth has been severely harmed by Russian and Ukrainian war. The growth is expected to be 2.5% in 2022 and 1.2% in 2023. Persistent war-related inflationary pressures and uncertainty holds back household consumption, showing the recovery in services. New incentives for the private sector and the National Recovery and Resilience Plan will mitigate some of the negative impacts of supply disruptions and uncertainty on investment. With regard to bilateral relations between Indonesia and Italy, throughout the years, the two countries have enjoyed a stable partnership. The cordial between the two countries have flourished since 1949, with Italy being one of the first European countries to acknowledge the independence and sovereignty of the Republic of Indonesia. Cooperation between the two countries has continuously shown positive notes. Italy are palm oil, stearic acid, and large flat-rolled stainless steel. During the last 25 years, the export of Indonesia to Italy have increased at an annualized rate of 2.88%. Imports from Italy, among others, consist of washing and bottling machines, acrylic hydrocarbons, and recovered paper. During the last 25 years, Indonesia's imports from Italy have increased at an annualized rate of 1.6%.
Let's go to the next report now. India will host the G20 Leaders Summit in New Delhi on September the 9th and 10th in 2023 under its presidency. And India will assume the presidency of the G20 for 1 year from December the 1st, 2022 to November the 30th, 2023. And it's expected to host over 200 meetings across the country beginning in December this year.
Now we also have India, countries prevail as the next host of G20 presidency. Let's have a look.
Located in the southern part of the Asian continent, India shares land border with Afghanistan and Pakistan in the west, China in the northeast, Bangladesh and Myanmar in the east. A short ferry ride from southern India will bring you to the island nation of Sri Lanka. With a landmass of nearly 3.3 million square kilometers, or more than 9 times than that of Germany, India is the 7th biggest country on earth. Despite its sheer size, India adopts single time zone, which is 5.5 hours ahead of Greenwich Mean Time, or GMT. India uses English as its formal language, but acknowledges 22 official languages such as Hindi, Bengali, and Tamil.
और उन्होंने सबको जोड़ा और आप सबने समय दिया.
Formerly the Chief Minister of Gujarat, the charismatic
In India Week is an opportunity to take stock.
With a populace of around 1.4 billion, India is the world's second most populous country after China. India is also the biggest democracy on earth, with a population of more than 4 times than that of the United States, which is the second largest democracy. India has a median age of 28.4 years, providing the country with demographic boon. With a birth rate average of 2.2, India outpaced that of China's 1.7 and projected to eclipse China as the world's largest populace in 2030. It is estimated that India will hit a total population of around 1.65 billion in 2060 before plateauing. India and Indonesia had enjoyed strong trade and cultural ties since the 1st century. With increasing spice trades came cultural and religious influences. Traders from India brought Hinduism as well as Buddhism into the Indonesian archipelago, and their syncretic fusion with local beliefs gave rise to a rather unique branch of Hinduism in Indonesia. Between the 6th and the 10th century, Buddhist and Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms such as Sriwijaya and Majapahit flourished in Indonesia, and cultural ties between India and Indonesia grew even stronger. Borobudur and Prambanan, respectively, the world's largest Buddhist and Hindu temples, and thousands of other temples across Indonesia were Founding fathers of India and Indonesia enjoyed strong ties in the early days of their respective independence. In 1955, India, Indonesia, along with Sri Lanka, held Asia-Africa Conference in Bandung, aimed at promoting independence of Asian and African nations from colonialism and introducing non-aligned movement.
Bilateral ties between India and Indonesia waned in late 1960s before reinvigorated in early 1990s as India adopted Look East policy. Globally known for its movie industry, Bollywood, and basic industries such as steel and petrochemicals, the Indian economy enjoyed GDP growth of above 6% for the most part over the past 3 decades. In 2020, the size of the Indian economy was close to $2.7 trillion US, and experts projected India to become the world's 5th largest economy by 2027. India is one of major buyers of Indonesian coal and palm oil. Indonesia also exports rubber and minerals such as copper to India. Meanwhile, India's main export to Indonesia consists of semi-finished iron, sugarcane, bovine meat, refined petroleum products. Two-way trade reached $20.9 billion US in 2021, tripled than $6.9 billion US recorded in 2008. Indian auto brands such as Tata has been making inroads into Indonesia in recent years, while Garuda Food from Indonesia is introducing its snacks to the Indian market. Well,
I'm actually still dancing, hearing the music from India.
I know, and those memories in Taj Mahal is a little less than 2 weeks ago. I still have hangover from it. Well, that's it. We have come to the end of our G20 highlights today, coming to you live from the beautiful Nusa Dua, Bali, Indonesia. Finally, I'm Rahmat Idris.
And I am Chodefi. Thank you so much for watching. And coming up next is G20 Overview with Eni Parinusa. So stay tuned with TVR World. Goodbye for now.
This is the atmosphere of Tenganan, a quiet and peaceful village. Here, we can feel the nuances of old Bali, at least through the architecture of this village.